Welcome to the Author's Den, a place where we encourage reading and writing, a place where you can meet authors and book illustrators, a place to get your questions answered about writing, publishing, and promoting your book. Hello and welcome to this edition of the Author's Den. Glad you could be with us today. My guest is Dr. Calvin McCray. Pleasure to have you here, by the way.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad to be here. It's wonderful.
He's a noted author, an educator, and we're going to be talking about his background and his book, Ebb Tide. Well, Dr. McCray, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, the south side of Chicago, and in 1924.
You've seen a lot happen since then.
Oh yes, right. The Great Depression years. I grew up during the Great Depression on the south side of Chicago, so I know what they're talking about when they talk about a depression. The things that have been happening lately in the last 2 or 3 generations. It's not the real depression. The real depression, we were talking about the 30s, before World War II.
How many were in your family?
I have a brother and a sister. We all grew up in Chicago, and but my mother's family's side is a very large side, and during those years, they all moved in together, you know. So I grew up with a large family.
You remember a lot of aunts and uncles around, or cousins?
That's right. Plenty of aunts, uncles, cousins, directions from all the family, and it didn't make any difference who was in charge. We knew that we would take directions from any of the cousins, uncles.
Is
brothers.
that kind of it takes a village type attitude?
Right, exactly.
Well,
The families then were different than families today. Yeah.
When you were growing up, was there an author or a book that really inspired you that you remember well?
In high school, I had a book that I read, and I mentioned it in my book, and I think that was the first book that I ever read, and it was about that thick. Studs Lonigan, and he grew up in Chicago too, and it's a trilogy of his growing up and dying in Chicago at a young age, and I made my first book report in Chicago as a senior on that particular book.
Let's talk a little bit about when you graduated from high school, you went to college, but you were in the military as well, that's right?
Yes, I went to the University of Illinois on a track scholarship, and in fact I had to compete against someone from the University of Michigan to get my scholarship at the University of Illinois. Yeah, Bob Ufer, and I later met him when I came to Michigan too, and of course 4 years in the service in the Coast Guard, then coming back to the University of Illinois and spending time on the GI Bill for 4 or 5 years. And
well, talk about the military. How did you join the military, and what was that like?
yes, I was planning to go into the Air Force during the military, the Tuskegee. My roommates, in fact, went to Tuskegee. I didn't quite get that chance to fly like I wanted to until after I came out of the service, and I enrolled at the University of Illinois flying school, and I still do some flying. And but I enlisted in the Coast Guard, and I was called up right after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and went in the Coast Guard.
I remember reading in your book that you ran into some fairly famous people in the course of your lifetime, and it started in the Coast Guard. Talk about who you ran into there.
There weren't many blacks in the Coast Guard at that time. We came in one at a time in the Coast Guard. It was a segregated unit, and but the first person that I met was Alex Haley. He was who wrote Roots, the book, and I was with him for a couple of months, and so others came in.
What was your relationship like with Alex Haley? How did you meet him? What role did he play in your life?
Well, when I first went in the Coast Guard, I was assigned at a place in New York City, 14 New Chambers Street. I can still remember the number of the place. It's a tall skyscraper, and because there was no place for them to assign me to, and that was when Alex Haley was assigned to me, or I was assigned to him.
Mm-hmm.
And this went on for 2 months until they could get enough enlistees to have a boot camp.
Did you have any inclination at that time that he was writing a book? Or
Oh, I had no idea. He was a wonderful person to meet, and certainly a mentor at that time. Showed me how to dress and gave me permission to leave on the weekends, and so that's how I got to know him. Of course, I saw him after the war many times after he wrote the book, and he toured the country, and I got a chance to meet him on many occasions.
That's nice.
Other blacks came into the Coast Guard at a one-to-one basis, and so we got a group together to have boot training, and that was when I met Jack Dempsey.
And for those who don't know, Jack Dempsey was the former world heavyweight champion.
Well, at first I didn't know, but then I found out right away, and then he was able to get me into some of the service schools. I went to school through Jack Dempsey. I wouldn't have never gotten that, being a black in the Coast Guard at that time.
Mm-hmm.
He just carried me over and enrolled me into the class, and as a quartermaster and a signalman. That was a right arm rating, and I worked with Timken on the bridge as we traveled from Nova Scotia all the way to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. And our job was to more or less supervise or keep an eye on all of these small ships that the government had taken over to defend America.
Mm-hmm.
And people wondered how these little ships could protect America's coast. But it was protection from the submarines during that particular time. During World War II, we usually talk about the going overseas, fighting overseas, but we never talk about the defense of America during the 40s, when the German submarines were sinking our ships that we were sending to Britain during that time. During my time in Long Island, New York, that was where I was stationed as a signalman, and when I wasn't involved in signaling, I was aboard ship, and we were traveling from Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, all the way to Nova Scotia, over 3,000 miles with these small ships. And the ships that I was on was the largest of the hundreds of ships that was in defense of America at that time. And and here's a picture. I'll carry this for good luck with me. And the ship that I was on, and the skipper of this ship is a two-masted schooner, 300 and some feet long.
Mm-hmm.
And we had depth charges. And we used depth charges along the East Coast during World War II, where the German submarines were very prominent, sinking our ships that we were sending, empty ships. We call them Liberty ships during that time, for supplies to Britain. And of course the war was over shortly after that, but the Germans were right on our shores during that time. We don't talk about that too much.
So after the military, you went back to school.
Right.
Talk about how the Fulbright Scholarship came about.
Well, this was doing my graduate work in 1950 at Indiana University. And I had just gotten married that year, and my wife and I entered the University of Indiana University. And it was during 1951, during a class that I heard about the Fulbright program. I applied for it and accepted.
What did the scholarship enable you to do?
The Fulbright was an exchange program. Someone came in my place in my school in Gary, Indiana, and I taught in England in someone's place.
Mm-hmm.
That was what the Fulbright program was about.
Had you traveled it prior to that at all?
No, not at all, except in the service. to New York and aboard ship and things.
But you hadn't been out of the country? Or?
Not out of the country. That was my first time to get out of the country. And I think that was the thing that really stimulated my educational travel. And from then on, I've been traveling to many countries through Michigan State as a professor, and to Africa and Japan and Central America, all through different programs, educational programs.
You've had such a varied and colorful life.
In the fall of '58, we went to England from New York, and that was where, while I was waiting to aboard ship, that was when I met Castro. While we were in the hotel in New York, there were conferences going on that we had to attend. Fulbright, how we would go about our Fulbright while we were in England. And while we were waiting in the hotel, Castro and his entourage was there preparing to go to Cuba. That was the last time that he was in the United States, by the way.
Well, what were your impressions of Castro?
Oh, he was a lot of fun. We were invited up to his room, an entourage of several men, and we joined in the eating session with him. And in fact, we were ordering our food when we met his entourage, and they invited us up to his room, and we stayed up there, and we almost missed the boat too, talking with him. And that's how we got to meet Castro.
But by the way, were you one of the only people of color on this trip?
Yes, I was the only person of color in the Fulbright program that year. Out of 100 that went to England, I was the only one that received the grant. Now my wife went along with me, and it was we met Nancy as soon as we arrived in England, in Southampton. She was there to greet us, and she was the head of the Fulbright program for the English.
You talk so casually about Nancy. Let's back up a bit.
Right.
Who is Nancy, and what significance did she play in your life and maybe in history as well?
Nancy, as we found out, was an American first, and during those years, you had dual citizenship. So Nancy had been an American. She was an American. Nancy was the first woman in Parliament in England. And she was an American from Virginia. And we found out that her background, her family actually had slaves. And she was born in 1879 after Emancipation Proclamation. But her family was still together, and the slave family was still together. And during that time, when slaves were free, not all of them just left their slave background. Some stayed. After all, they'd been there through generations, many were comfortable to stay there. So Nancy grew up during this period in Virginia. My wife and I got the feeling that it was because of her slave background that many times she traveled back to England to get away from the concepts of this. But Nancy had a very liking for black women who brought her up during her childhood days. And I feel that it was my wife that Nancy had more of an affection for during our year in England. And so I certainly want to mention the part that my wife played in this too, as an innocent passenger going to England, but ending up getting a job through Nancy. And all the things that happened that we talked about during that year, Nancy was a part of the participation in that, like meeting with the Queen Mother and talking with the Queen who was in Chicago during my stay. And she was opening the St. Lawrence Seaway during that time. She was taking part in that while I was in England, and meeting Prince Charles, and all of these things she could do over the telephone.
And these are all things that you talk about in your book as well.
Yes, right. In other words, her connection. She was so powerful, if I can use that word to say, as a woman during that particular period. She and Churchill were certainly very close during World War I and World War II. And the things that she could get on the telephone and do for, in fact, getting my wife a job, and my wife didn't have the connections to get a job.
And she helped you.
What's that?
She helped your wife.
Oh yeah, she got her a job, and that changed my wife's plans all of a sudden.
Why did you write the book?
I saved all the things that I have from high school on, and these materials that I had on Nancy were in boxes. I didn't want to throw these materials away, and I said, I'm going to do something with all of these things, and I did it. But along the way, I've had so many other attractions that really kept me from writing. Now I got in the period that I really want a second edition of this, because people are calling me and saying they want to know more about different people like Jack Dempsey.
So again, the question I asked you earlier was about why write the book, and you said that you didn't want to see your mementos go to waste, or?
She affected our lives in such a way. I wouldn't say that she was a mentor, because it wasn't that long, it wasn't that period. But what she did in that particular amount of time was just fascinating.
Really
Imagine someone making all the connections for you that would last the rest of your life, more or less, that she did in such a short period of time. I don't know anyone here that I could get to do that in one day.
She really befriended you and took you under her wing, didn't she?
Exactly.
She really took you under her wing. She introduced you to people. She helped opportunities happen. Found places for you to stay as well.
Right. She made all those things really happen, like seeing Prince Charles while he was 10 years old. Yeah, we were invited to his 10th anniversary birthday. Yeah, and she did as much as she could, and it was really too much for that year. Many things we just couldn't do because there were meetings with other Fulbrights that were planned, and we tried, and meeting the people on the Isle of Wight. That was a historical event that I could write another book about that.
So you really want people to understand the relationship that you had, and you and your wife had with Nancy Astor, how much she extended herself to you, the opportunities that she helped make happen for you.
Yes, during that particular time, when I was riding in her car, I couldn't have been riding with Nancy in America, in Virginia at that time. The laws wouldn't have allowed that. I don't know whether the younger generation would understand that, but during my time coming up, you couldn't do that.
Racism was much more...
Right, racism prevented that. And Nancy was aware of all of that, because during her stay in England, she frequently came back home to the United States to visit and go back and forth. So it was a regular thing for her to do. She stayed aware of the conditions in America and was part of a world travel.
Well, let's talk about the physical book for a minute. You saved all your mementos and notes and things like that. Did you have any help putting the book together? How did it come together?
Well, really through the help of the library here too.
Tell us about that.
I spent many a day here in the library, and I guess I knew everyone here. And in fact, two of them I saw passing through, coming in here today, and I've got plenty of help. So you could say everyone was a mentor in a way that, encouraged me to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Once I got started in that, now I'm ready to go at this stage of the game.
Did you have somebody proof it, or did you type it into a computer, or any of those
I
things?
got everyone here in the library that I could get to do different little things for me, and I would take my time and pull it all together through. But Vivian, my wife, saved all the clippings and things. And since that time, I've cut them out and put those aside and still have a lot of things, but all the writings, I've duplicated those and threw all the trimmings away. You just can't save everything. But since that time, I've saved all the other travel things, teaching in Japan. And I have all the books and things on that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to decide what I'm going to do with that.
I'm sure there's another book there
And
somewhere.
teaching in Africa. And it was difficult to decide where I wanted to start to write if I were going to do it. But Nancy was the place that gave me the start and the thinking that I really wanted to start with. I didn't feel that I could start anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. How did you get the book published?
Yeah, it was through self-publishing, and I met someone through the book club that I met in Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
and it was published through Detroit, and as a self-publishing.
If someone wanted to find a copy of the book, how could they do that?
Well, they can well, I have a website too now.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, so that's one way. They can get it from a library, and right here, in the local section of the library for local writers, and all they have to do is go to any library.
Could we
or
Google it or Amazon and find
Amazon, and yes,
Mm-hmm.
and in fact, I'm getting some royalties now that I feel real good about after 2 years of it. It's exactly 2 years to the day that things really the book was published, and right. So people are beginning to hear about it, and more people other than the African American, they're not the ones that are really interested in, and there's other cultural groups coming to America that don't know about what went on in America at that time.
Our history.
Yeah, our history. And the interesting thing, the year that I was in England was the year that that General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, sent his troops in to Little Rock to get the Little Rock Nine into Little Rock High School.
And you were in England at that time?
And I was in England at that time, and everyone wanted to know about that, and of course I didn't get into that discussion. That wasn't the thing to really get into it. But it certainly hit the world at that time. Eisenhower, retiring as a general and then becoming president, and the Fulbright program, getting people like me to go to England, and Senator Fulbright School in Arkansas. Black students couldn't go to school there, and I could go and teach and go to school in England, and it was just something that people want to know about and try to untangle.
Put it in a context of some type.
Yes, right. Because the civil rights laws hadn't passed yet until 64 and 65, and this was in 58.
Right.
So people weren't voting, and Nancy frequently talked about even her parents couldn't vote in America.
And there was no women's movement at that time?
And women couldn't vote at that time either. And certainly she was sympathetic towards black people, particularly the black woman, and because that was her experiences in life. And we were fortunate to get involved in that, and we were the envy of all the other Fulbrights. In '99, when we got together, they learned about Nancy, of course, and we learned about Nancy, and we felt fortunate too. And that was the reason, I think, that I really wanted to write about
How did you maintain a relationship with Nancy Astor over the years, or what's the last thing you remember speaking about with her?
Well, things kind of, her family, well, she had a lot of family problems after that, and it was very difficult. It was difficult to keep in touch with her after she died 6 years after we arrived back in the States.
When you look back over the time that you spent in England and the people that you met, what's the main lesson that you bring home from that?
I would say education, how people of various cultures learn and evolve. And as a result of that, I got involved into, and this is another book too, while happening at Michigan State, going to Japan and teaching, working with officers, which I became an officer automatically working with the U.S. government and training officers in Japan, and my family going with me too, and developing a program which is another book that is just about complete now. I mean, I have all the materials, so I have learned from that book how to write another book that it won't take as long. I have all the materials for that ready to go now. It's just a matter now of getting a sponsor maybe and getting that book printed.
If someone were watching this show and hearing your interview, what advice could you give a person who might want to write a book?
They've got to get stimulated in some way through school. Someone has to say, look, once you write it down that you want to do it, somewhere in your life you're going to want to take it up. You may have to get a little motivation, like I was getting it from the library and all the people that I knew that were pushing me. But you got to set a certain piece of your life to do it, because there's, as in my case, there were so many interesting things going on too that were pulling me apart from that.
So are you saying that you need to really just devote some time? You'd encourage them to devote some time, make it a point to write?
But you've got to write it down and say, this is what I want to do. And once you seem to write it down, you've got to find a place in your life to do it.
It takes time.
It does. It takes time, and you've got to find that place in your life to put it in there.
Dr. McCray, thanks so much
Thank
for being
you
here
very
today.
much,
It's a pleasure
Mike,
meeting
and
you.
the pleasure's been mine.
Okay.
And you can see that I'm getting warmed up.